Captain Robert Hayes had been flying commercial airlines for 23 years. He thought he had seen everything during his time in the cockpit. From emergency landings to difficult passengers, from severe weather conditions to technical malfunctions, nothing seemed to surprise him anymore. But on that ordinary Tuesday morning in March, something happened that would shake him to his core and change his perspective on life forever. The morning started like any other at Chicago, our international airport. Captain Hayes arrived early, as was his habit, to review the flight plan for United Airlines Flight 847 bound for Seattle. The 737 was scheduled for a routine 3-hour flight with 156 passengers on board. The weather forecast showed clear skies, and all systems were functioning perfectly. His co-pilot, First Officer Sarah Martinez, was someone he had flown with many times before. They worked well together and shared the same professional approach to flying. As passengers began boarding, Captain Hayes noticed the usual mix of business travelers, families, and tourists. The flight attendants went through their pre-flight procedures, checking seat belts, overhead compartments, and ensuring everyone was comfortable. Everything seemed completely normal. The ground crew finished loading luggage, and the catering service had stocked the plane with meals and beverages. Among the passengers was a young woman in her early 30s who caught the attention of several crew members. She was traveling alone in seat 14C, wearing simple jeans and a navy blue sweater. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack as her carry-on luggage. What made her stand out was not her appearance, but rather her nervous behavior. She kept checking her phone, looking around anxiously, and seemed uncomfortable whenever flight attendants approached her. Flight attendant Jennifer noticed the woman's nervousness and approached her with a warm smile. "First time flying?" she asked kindly, thinking the passenger might be afraid of flying. The woman looked up with tired eyes and simply nodded, not offering any conversation. Jennifer offered her a magazine and assured her that turbulence was unlikely on this route, but the passenger just smiled weakly and turned to look out the window. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Captain Hayes made his routine announcement over the intercom. "Good morning, ladies, and this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard United Airlines Flight 847 with service to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Our flight time today will be approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. We're currently third in line for takeoff, so we should be airborne in about 10 minutes. The weather in Seattle is partly cloudy with a temperature of 52 degrees. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." The takeoff was smooth, and soon they were climbing to their cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. Captain Hayes settled into the routine of monitoring instruments and communicating with air traffic control. First Officer Martinez handled the radio communications while keeping an eye on the navigation systems. The autopilot engaged, and the flight proceeded without any issues. About an hour into the flight, something unusual happened that would later prove to be significant. Flight attendant Jennifer was serving beverages in the main cabin when she noticed the nervous young woman in 14C had fallen asleep. But what caught her attention was a small piece of paper that had fallen from the woman's hand onto the floor. Jennifer picked it up, intending to place it on the woman's tray table, but couldn't help noticing what was written on it. The paper contained what appeared to be a phone number and an address in Seattle, along with the words, "Safe House Ask for Maria." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. In her 12 years as a flight attendant, she had received training about human trafficking and how to spot potential victims. The combination of the woman's nervous behavior, her reluctance to talk, and now this mysterious note raised red flags in her mind. Jennifer quietly showed the note to her colleague, flight attendant Mark Stevens, who had even more experience recognizing signs of distress in passengers. They both agreed that something seemed wrong. The woman appeared to be traveling against her will, though they couldn't be certain. Mark suggested they should inform the captain, but Jennifer hesitated, worried they might be overreacting to what could be an innocent situation. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hayes was enjoying the peaceful flight. The weather was cooperating, all systems were functioning normally, and they were making good time. He and First Officer Martinez were discussing weekend plans when Jennifer knocked on the cockpit door. She entered looking concerned and asked to speak privately with the captain. "Captain Hayes," she said quietly, "we have a passenger in 14C who's exhibiting some unusual behavior. She seems extremely nervous, won't engage in conversation, and I found this note that fell from her hand." She handed him the piece of paper with the address and phone number. Captain Hayes examined the note carefully. His expression grew serious as he considered the implications. He had heard about cases of human trafficking involving commercial flights, though he had never encountered one personally. The airline had provided training on these situations, emphasizing the importance of crew alertness and proper protocols. "What's your assessment of the situation?" he asked Jennifer, trusting her experience and instincts. "I'm not certain, but something feels wrong," she replied. "The woman seems scared, and this note mentions a safe house. I've been watching her, and she keeps looking around as if she's afraid someone is following her or monitoring her movements." Captain Hayes thanked Jennifer for bringing this to his attention and told her he would handle the situation. After she left the cockpit, he discussed the matter with First Officer Martinez, who agreed that they should take the concerns seriously. They decided to contact air traffic control to report the suspicious circumstances, following the protocol they had learned in their training. "Seattle approach, United 847, Captain Hayes said into his radio. "We have a potential security concern on board and request priority handling upon arrival." United 847, Seattle approach, understood. "Can you provide details about the nature of the concern?" "We have a passenger who may be traveling under duress. Request law enforcement meet the aircraft upon arrival." "Roger, United 847, priority handling approved. Law enforcement will be standing by." As the flight continued toward Seattle, Captain Hayes couldn't stop thinking about the young woman in seat 14C. He had made the right decision to alert authorities, but he wondered what her story really was. Was she truly a victim of human trafficking, or was there another explanation for her behavior and the mysterious note? The crew continued to monitor the situation discreetly while maintaining normal flight operations. The woman remained asleep for most of the journey, which both relieved and concerned the flight attendants. When she was awake, she continued to display the same nervous behavior, checking her phone frequently and avoiding eye contact with crew members. As they began their descent into Seattle, Captain Hayes prepared for what might be a very unusual arrival. He had no idea that the truth about his passenger would be far more shocking than anything he could have imagined. The 737 touched down smoothly at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time. As Captain Hayes taxied toward the gate, he could see several police vehicles and what appeared to be federal agents waiting on the tarmac. The sight made him more certain that they had made the right decision in reporting their concerns about the passenger in seat 14C. "Ladies, and welcome to Seattle," Captain Hayes announced over the intercom. "The local time is 2:50 p.m., and the temperature is 54 degrees under partly cloudy skies. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened until we reach the gate and the seat belt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with United Airlines." As soon as the aircraft came to a complete stop at gate B7, Captain Hayes shut down the engines and completed his post-flight checklist. Before the passengers could begin deplaning, 2 FBI agents and 3 Seattle Police Department officers boarded the aircraft. They were led by Special Agent Lisa, a seasoned investigator with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Agent approached the cockpit first to speak with Captain Hayes and get a full briefing on the situation. She was a professional woman in her 40s with short brown hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her partner, Agent, was a tall man with graying temples who had worked trafficking cases for over 15 years. "Captain Hayes, I'm Special Agent with the FBI," she said, showing her credentials. "Can you walk me through exactly what happened during the flight and what led to your concerns about this passenger?" Captain Hayes explained the entire situation, from flight attendant Jennifer's initial observations to the discovery of the note with the address and mention of a safe house. He provided as much detail as possible while Agent took careful notes. "Where is the passenger now?" Agent asked. "Still in seat 14C. We've instructed all passengers to remain seated until you've had a chance to handle the situation," Captain Hayes replied. Agent nodded and made her way into the main cabin with her partner and the police officers. The other passengers watched with curiosity and some concern as the law enforcement team moved through the aircraft. Many began whispering among themselves, wondering what kind of emergency or security issue had occurred. When Agent reached row 14, she found the young woman sitting quietly, looking even more nervous than before. The woman's hands were trembling slightly, and her eyes showed clear signs of fear when she saw the agents approaching. "Ma'am, I'm Special Agent with the FBI," she said in a calm, reassuring voice. "We'd like to speak with you privately. You're not in any trouble, but we have some concerns about your safety and well-being." The woman looked up with wide eyes, and for a moment, Agent thought she might try to run. Instead, she began to cry softly, which only reinforced the agent's suspicions that they were dealing with a trafficking victim. "Please, I just want to go home," the woman whispered through her tears. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I know you haven't," Agent said gently. "We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" My name is, she said hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she should reveal even that basic information. Agent noticed the hesitation and the way looked around nervously before answering. These were classic signs of someone who had been coached on what to say or who was afraid of the consequences of speaking freely. "We're going to take you somewhere safe where we can talk privately," Agent explained. "You have nothing to fear from us. We're here to protect you." As the agents prepared to escort off the aircraft, Captain Hayes watched from the cockpit door. He felt a sense of satisfaction that his crew had potentially saved someone from a terrible situation. Human trafficking was a serious crime that ruined countless lives, and he was proud that United Airlines had trained their staff to recognize the warning signs. The other passengers were finally allowed to deplane after had been escorted away. Many of them continued to speculate about what had happened, with some correctly guessing that it involved human trafficking. Flight attendant Jennifer felt validated in her decision to report her concerns, knowing that she might have helped save someone's life. At the Seattle FBI field office, agent and agent began their interview within a comfortable room designed to put victims at ease. The room had soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and calming colors on the walls. A victim advocate named Sarah was also present to provide support and ensure understood her rights. "You're in a safe place now," Agent began. "No one can hurt you here. We want to help you, but we need you to tell us the truth about your situation. Can you start by telling us your full name and where you're from?" Looked around the room nervously before answering. "My real name is Santos. I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, but please, you have to understand, I'm not supposed to talk to anyone. They said terrible things would happen if I talked to police or anyone in authority." "Who said those things to you?" Agent asked gently. Hesitated for a long moment before continuing. "The people who were keeping me. They said they had connections everywhere and that law enforcement couldn't protect me. They said if I ever tried to escape or get help, they would find me and make me disappear forever." The agents exchanged glances. This was consistent with the psychological control tactics used by human traffickers to keep their victims compliant and afraid to seek help. Agent leaned forward slightly. "Those people lied to you. They wanted you to believe that so you wouldn't try to get help, but you're safe now and we have the resources to protect you. Can you tell us how you ended up in this situation?" Story began to unfold slowly. She explained that 6 months earlier, she had been a college student at Arizona State University studying journalism. She was working part-time at a coffee shop to help pay for her education when she met a man named who seemed charming and interested in helping her career. "Told me he worked in the entertainment industry and could help me get internships with news stations in Los Angeles," continued. "He was very convincing and seemed to know a lot about the media business. He said he had connections that could help me get ahead in my career." Agent nodded, recognizing this as a common recruitment tactic used by traffickers. They often targeted young women with promises of career opportunities or modeling contracts. "What happened after you met?" he asked. "He invited me to Los Angeles for what he called an interview with a major news network," said. "He paid for my flight and hotel, and I thought it was a legitimate opportunity. But when I got to Los Angeles, everything changed." Described how it had taken her to what she thought was a hotel, but which turned out to be a house where several other young women were being held against their will. She was told that she owed money for her transportation and accommodations, and that she would have to work to pay off her debt. "They took my phone, my identification, and all my personal belongings," she explained. "They said I couldn't leave until I had earned enough money to pay them back, but the amount kept getting bigger every day. They charged me for food, for the room, for everything." The agents recognized this as debt bondage, another common tactic used by human traffickers to maintain control over their victims. The debts were designed to be impossible to pay off, creating a form of modern slavery. Agent asked about the note that had been found on the airplane. His response would shock everyone involved in the case and completely change their understanding of the situation. "That note," said quietly, "wasn't what you think it is. The address and phone number aren't for another trafficking location. They're for my Aunt Maria in Seattle. She's a social worker who runs a legitimate safe house for women escaping domestic violence and human trafficking situations." The agents were surprised by this revelation. If was escaping from traffickers and heading to a legitimate safe house, why had she seemed so nervous and frightened during the flight? Agent said carefully, "If you were escaping from your traffickers and going to your aunt for help, why were you so afraid on the airplane? Why didn't you tell the flight crew that you were a victim seeking help?" His answer would reveal the truth that would shock Captain Hayes and everyone else involved in the case. Santos took a deep breath and looked directly at Agent. What she said next would completely change everything the FBI agents thought they knew about the case. "I was afraid on the airplane because I thought and his associates might have followed me," began. "But there's something else you need to know, something that makes this situation much more complicated than you realize." Agent leaned forward, sensing that they were about to learn something significant. "What is it?" "Isn't just some random human trafficker," said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His real name is Wellington, and he's the son of Congressman James Wellington from California, the same Congressman Wellington who chairs the House Subcommittee on Human Trafficking." The room fell silent. Agent and agent stared at in disbelief. Congressman James Wellington was one of the most vocal advocates for anti-trafficking legislation in Washington. He had built his political career on being tough on crime and protecting victims of human trafficking. "Are you certain about this?" Agent asked. Those detailed knowledge and the specific nature of her claim suggested she was telling the truth. "I'm positive," replied. "Showed me pictures of himself with his father at political events. He bragged about how his father's position gave him protection and connections in law enforcement. That's why I was so afraid to talk to anyone in authority. Told me his father had people everywhere and that no one would believe me if I tried to report what was happening." Agent was already reaching for his phone to contact his supervisor. This was no longer just a human trafficking case. It was potentially a massive political scandal involving a sitting member of Congress. Continued her story, providing details that made the agent's blood run cold. She explained that had used his father's political connections to avoid scrutiny for his criminal activities. The house in Los Angeles where and other women were held was actually owned through a shell company connected to Congressman Wellington's business interests. "Told me that his father knew about the operation," said. "He said the congressman was getting a cut of the profits and that they had been running this business for years. They targeted young women from middle-class families who wouldn't be immediately missed, especially college students who were away from home." Agent was taking detailed notes while trying to process the implications of what was telling them. If her allegations were true, they were dealing with corruption at the highest levels of government. "Do you have any proof of these connections between and his father?" Agent asked. "I saw documents," replied. "Was careless sometimes when he thought we weren't paying attention. I saw bank statements and contracts that had Congressman Wellington's name on them. There were also photos of with his father at what looked like private meetings with other men I didn't recognize." The case was becoming more complex by the minute. Agent knew they would need to handle this investigation very carefully, as any leaks could compromise their ability to gather evidence and could potentially allow the suspects to destroy incriminating materials. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Captain Hayes was completing his post-flight paperwork when Agent called to speak with him. She couldn't reveal all the details of the ongoing investigation, but she wanted to thank him and his crew for their alertness and professionalism. "Captain Hayes, I want you to know that your crew's observations and quick thinking may have helped us uncover something much bigger than we initially realized," Agent said over the phone. "I'm glad we could help," Captain Hayes replied. "Is the young woman safe?" "Yes, she's safe, and she's receiving all the support she needs," Agent assured him. "However, I need to ask that you and your crew maintain confidentiality about this incident for now. We're conducting an ongoing investigation, and any publicity could compromise our efforts." Captain Hayes agreed to keep the matter confidential and passed the message along to his crew members. He was curious about what Agent meant by something much bigger. but he understood the need for discretion in sensitive investigations. Over the next several days, the FBI launched a comprehensive investigation into allegations. They obtained warrants to search the Los Angeles house where it had been held, as well as several properties connected to shell companies linked to Congressman Wellington's financial interests. The search of the Los Angeles house yielded disturbing evidence. Investigators found evidence that multiple women had been held there against their will, including personal belongings, identification documents, and hidden cameras that had been used to monitor the victims. They also discovered financial records showing payments to various individuals and businesses that appeared to be part of the trafficking network. More shocking was the discovery of a hidden safe that contained correspondence between Wellington and his father, Congressman James Wellington. The documents clearly showed that the congressman was not only aware of his son's criminal activities, but was actively involved in planning and financing the operation. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a handwritten note from the congressman to his son that read, "The Phoenix operation is too risky. Move to smaller cities where local law enforcement is less sophisticated. I can provide cover for you in Nevada and Oregon through my contacts." As the investigation expanded, agents interviewed other victims who had escaped from the trafficking operation over the past 2 years. Their testimonies painted a picture of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity due to political protection and corruption. The FBI also discovered that Congressman Wellington had used his position on the Human Trafficking Subcommittee to steer funding away from certain law enforcement initiatives that might have uncovered his son's activities. He had also used his political influence to have certain investigations dropped or redirected. Agent knew that they were building a strong case, but she also understood the challenges they would face in prosecuting such high-profile defendants. Political corruption cases involving sitting congressmen required approval from the highest levels of the Department of Justice, and often became media circuses that could complicate prosecution efforts. As news of the investigation began to leak to the media, Congressman Wellington's office issued a statement denying any wrongdoing and claiming that the congressman was being targeted by political enemies. The congressman hired one of Washington's most expensive criminal defense attorneys and began preparing for what would surely be a lengthy legal battle. Santos, meanwhile, was placed in protective custody while the investigation continued. She was working with victim advocates and receiving counseling to help her recover from her traumatic experiences. Her Aunt Maria in Seattle was providing emotional support and helping her begin the process of rebuilding her life. The young woman who had seemed so nervous on United Flight 847 was now at the center of one of the biggest political scandals in recent memory. Her courage in coming forward despite her fears had exposed a criminal network that reached into the halls of Congress itself. But the story was far from over. As federal investigators continued to follow the evidence, they would uncover connections and revelations that would shock the nation and forever change how people viewed the intersection of political power and organized crime. 3 weeks after Santos had been taken into protective custody, the FBI investigation had grown into one of the largest federal corruption cases in recent history. What started as a routine human trafficking investigation had uncovered a web of corruption involving multiple government officials, law enforcement personnel, and business leaders across several states. Special Agent found herself leading a task force of over 30 federal agents, working around the clock to piece together the full scope of the criminal enterprise. The evidence they had gathered painted a disturbing picture of how political power had been used to protect and enable serious criminal activity for years. The breakthrough in the case came when agents arrested Wellington at a luxury hotel in San. Unlike his confident demeanor when he had controlled and other victims, seemed terrified when confronted with federal charges carrying potential life sentences. Within hours of his arrest, he began cooperating with investigators in exchange for a plea agreement. Revealed details that shocked even experienced federal agents who had worked organized crime cases for decades. The trafficking operation was just one part of a larger criminal enterprise that included money laundering, drug trafficking, and political corruption spanning multiple states. "My father didn't just know about what I was doing," told investigators during a recorded interview. "He was the one who suggested I get into the trafficking business in the first place. He said it was safer than drugs because the victims were less likely to go to police, and law enforcement was less focused on it. Agent listened to the recording with disgust and amazement. Congressman Wellington had essentially treated human trafficking like a business opportunity, calculating the risks and benefits with cold detachment. Went on to explain how his father had used his political position to create a protective shield around their criminal activities. The congressman had cultivated relationships with local law enforcement officials in several states, often helping them obtain federal funding for their departments in exchange for their willingness to overlook certain activities. He would call sheriffs and police chiefs and tell them that certain investigations might interfere with ongoing federal operations, explained. Most of them just assumed he was talking about legitimate federal investigations and would back off. He never had to explicitly tell them to ignore crimes. He just created enough confusion and uncertainty that they wouldn't pursue things too aggressively. The FBI was also uncovering the financial structure that had allowed the criminal enterprise to operate for so long. Congressman Wellington had established a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that were used to launder money from various illegal activities. Some of these companies had even received legitimate government contracts, creating a bizarre situation where taxpayer money was being funneled to criminal enterprises. One of the most shocking discoveries was that several other political figures had been involved in the scheme, either directly or through willful ignorance. A state senator from Nevada had received large campaign contributions from Wellington's shell companies in exchange for supporting legislation that reduced penalties for certain trafficking-related offenses. A mayor in Oregon had accepted bribes to ensure that city police would not investigate businesses owned by the Wellington network. As the investigation expanded, Captain Robert Hayes found himself drawn deeper into the case than he had ever expected. Agent contacted him again, this time asking him to testify before a federal grand jury about the events on Flight 847 and his crew's observations. "Captain Hayes," Agent explained during a phone call, "your testimony will be crucial in establishing the timeline of this escape and the circumstances that led to her rescue. The defense attorneys are going to argue that was never actually a victim and that she made up her story for attention or money." Captain Hayes was appalled by the suggestion that had fabricated her ordeal. "Agent, I saw that young woman's fear with my own eyes. There's no way she was acting. She was genuinely terrified." "I believe you completely," Agent assured him. "But we need you to tell that story to the grand jury so they can hear it from someone with your credibility and experience." The grand jury testimony took place in a secure federal courthouse in Seattle. Captain Hayes had never been involved in a criminal case before, and he was nervous about testifying in such a high-profile investigation. However, his years of experience as a pilot had taught him to remain calm under pressure and to stick to the facts. During his testimony, Captain Hayes described in detail his observations of behavior, the crew's concerns, and the decision to alert authorities. He explained how his training had prepared him to recognize potential trafficking situations and how the crew had followed proper protocols. "In my 23 years of flying commercial aircraft," Captain Hayes told the grand jury, "I had never encountered a situation quite like this. But the training United Airlines provided made it clear that we should err on the side of caution when we suspected someone might be traveling under duress." The grand jury was particularly interested in Captain Hayes's impressions of his emotional state during the flight. His testimony helped establish that he had been genuinely afraid and distressed, contradicting any potential defense argument that she had been acting or fabricating her situation. Meanwhile, Santos was continuing to work with federal prosecutors to build the strongest possible case against her captors and their political protectors. The process was emotionally difficult for her, as she had to relive traumatic experiences and face the reality that powerful people had used and exploited her for their own profit. Had also become something of a reluctant public figure as news of the case began to dominate headlines across the country. The story of a congressman involved in human trafficking while publicly advocating against it had captured the attention of media outlets nationwide. "I never wanted to be famous," told her victim advocate Sarah during one of their sessions. "I just wanted to escape and get my life back. Now I feel like the whole world is watching me." Sarah helped understand that her courage in coming forward was inspiring other victims to speak out about their own experiences. The FBI had received dozens of tips from people who believed they had information about the Wellington network or similar operations. As the case moved toward indictment, Agent reflected on how a routine flight from Chicago to Seattle had unraveled one of the most significant political corruption cases in recent memory. The investigation had already led to the arrests of 12 individuals, including Congressman Wellington, his son, 3 other political figures, and several business associates. The financial scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Investigators had traced over $15 million in illegal proceeds through the network of shell companies and offshore accounts. They had also identified at least 47 victims of the trafficking operation, many of whom had been too afraid to come forward, until news of the arrests gave them confidence that their captors could no longer harm them. But perhaps the most significant impact of the case was the light it shed on how political corruption could enable and protect serious criminal activity. The investigation had revealed systematic weaknesses in oversight and accountability that had allowed the Wellington network to operate with impunity for years. As federal prosecutors prepared for what would surely be one of the most watched trials in recent history, they knew that the case would have implications far beyond the specific individuals involved. The trial would test the principle that no one, regardless of their political position or connections, was above the law. The young woman who had nervously boarded United Flight 847 with nothing but a backpack and a phone number for her aunt's safe house had become the key witness in a case that would change American politics forever. 8 months after that fateful flight from Chicago to Seattle, the federal courthouse in Los Angeles was packed with media representatives, legal observers, and members of the public who had come to witness the trial of former Congressman James Wellington. The case had become known as Operation Flight Path, named after the investigation that began with Captain Hayes' decision to alert authorities about a suspicious passenger. Santos sat in the witness section, no longer the frightened young woman who had boarded Flight 847. She had spent months in therapy and had found the strength to not only testify against her captors, but also to become an advocate for other trafficking victims. Her transformation from victim to survivor to activist had inspired people across the country. The prosecution team, led by Assistant United States Attorney Michael, had built what many legal experts considered to be an airtight case. They had financial records, recorded conversations, victim testimony, and most importantly, the cooperation of Wellington, who had agreed to testify against his father in exchange for a reduced sentence. Former Congressman Wellington, now 62 years old with graying hair and a face that showed the stress of the past 8 months, sat at the defense table with his team of expensive lawyers. He had maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, claiming that he was the victim of a political witch hunt designed to destroy his career. As the trial began, Captain Robert Hayes found himself once again playing a crucial role in the case. He was one of the first witnesses called by the prosecution, and his testimony helped establish the credibility of the entire investigation. "Captain Hayes," attorney asked during direct examination, "when you made the decision to alert authorities about Ms. Santos, what was going through your mind?" Captain Hayes, wearing his dress uniform, spoke clearly and confidently. "I was thinking about the safety and welfare of my passenger. My crew and I are trained to recognize when someone might be in distress or danger, and everything about Ms. Santos's behavior suggested she needed help." The defense attorneys attempted to undermine Captain Hayes' testimony by suggesting that he had overreacted to normal passenger nervousness. However, his 23 years of experience and professional demeanor made their attacks ineffective. "Captain Hayes," the defense attorney asked, "isn't it true that many passengers are nervous about flying and that you may have misinterpreted normal anxiety for something more sinister?" Captain Hayes remained calm and professional. "Sir, I've seen thousands of nervous passengers over the years. Ms. Santos's behavior was distinctly different. She wasn't afraid of flying, she was afraid of something or someone else. That became clear as we learned more about her situation." The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Santos took the stand to testify against her former captors. The courtroom was completely silent as she described her ordeal in detail, from her initial recruitment by Wellington to her eventual escape and the flight that had led to the investigation. His testimony was powerful and convincing. She spoke with clarity and determination, providing specific details about the trafficking operation and the involvement of Congressman Wellington. Her credibility was enhanced by her composed demeanor and the consistency of her statements with the physical evidence that had been gathered. "Ms. Santos," attorney asked, "how can you be certain that Congressman Wellington knew about and was involved in his son's criminal activities?" Looked directly at the former congressman as she answered, "Because I was present during phone conversations between and his father where they discussed the business openly. Congressman Wellington would give advice about which locations to avoid and which law enforcement officials could be trusted to look the other way. He treated human trafficking like any other business venture." The defense team's cross-examination of was aggressive but ultimately unsuccessful. They attempted to portray her as an unreliable witness who was seeking revenge or financial gain. However, remained calm and consistent in her responses, and the jury appeared to find her testimony credible. Wellington's testimony against his father was perhaps the most damaging evidence presented during the trial. He provided detailed information about the structure of the criminal enterprise and his father's central role in planning and protecting it. "My father told me that political connections were the most valuable asset in any criminal enterprise. He said that as long as we had people in government protecting us, we could operate with very little risk." The defense attorneys argued that was lying about his father's involvement in order to reduce his own sentence. However, the prosecution presented recorded phone conversations and financial documents that corroborated his testimony and demonstrated the congressman's active participation in the criminal conspiracy. As the trial progressed, additional witnesses about the broader scope of the corruption network. Several law enforcement officials admitted to receiving bribes or pressure to ignore certain investigations. Business associates described meetings where criminal activities were planned and profits were divided. The financial evidence was particularly damning. Forensic accountants traced millions of dollars in illegal proceeds through the network of shell companies controlled by Congressman Wellington. They showed how legitimate political donations had been mixed with criminal profits, creating a complex money laundering scheme that had operated for years. After 6 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury for deliberation. The 12 jurors spent 3 days carefully reviewing the evidence before reaching their verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit human trafficking," the jury foreman announced, "we find the defendant, James Wellington, guilty." The former congressman showed no emotion as the guilty verdict was read on all 27 counts against him. He was immediately taken into custody and would later be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The convictions in the Wellington case led to broader reforms in how political corruption and human trafficking cases were investigated and prosecuted. Congress passed new legislation requiring stricter financial disclosure requirements for elected officials and their family members. Law enforcement agencies received additional training on recognizing and investigating trafficking operations that might have political protection. Captain Robert Hayes was recognized by the FBI and United Airlines for his role in uncovering the criminal enterprise. He received a commendation from the director of the FBI and was featured in training materials used to teach other airline crews how to recognize potential trafficking situations. "I was just doing my job," Captain Hayes said during an interview after the trial concluded. "But this case showed me how important it is for everyone to be alert and willing to speak up when they see something that doesn't seem right. You never know what you might uncover." Santos completed her college degree and went on to law school, where she specialized in victim advocacy and human trafficking law. She established a foundation that provided support services for trafficking victims and worked to improve training for airline crews and other transportation workers who might encounter victims during their travels. Flight attendant Jennifer, whose initial observations had triggered the entire investigation, became a national spokesperson for airline industry efforts to combat human trafficking. She traveled to airports across the country to train other crew members on how to recognize warning signs and properly report suspicious situations. The case also had a lasting impact on the airline industry. United Airlines and other major carriers enhanced their training programs and established new protocols for handling potential trafficking situations. The International Air Transport Association developed global standards for crew training on human trafficking recognition. 5 years after Flight 847 landed in Seattle, Captain Hayes was approaching retirement from his flying career. As he reflected on the case that had changed so many lives, he thought about the importance of ordinary people being willing to act when they encountered extraordinary situations. The young woman who had seemed so nervous during what should have been a routine flight had become a symbol of courage and resilience. Her willingness to trust the airline crew and law enforcement had led to the rescue of dozens of other victims and the dismantling of a criminal network that reached the highest levels of government. What had started as a joke among some passengers about a nervous flyer had ended in shock when the captain and everyone else involved learned who Santos really was and what her rescue had uncovered. The case served as a powerful reminder that human trafficking was not just a problem in distant countries or shadowy corners of society, but could involve respected political figures and operate in plain sight. The investigation that began with a concerned flight attendant picking up a piece of paper from an airplane floor had ultimately changed laws, saved lives, and demonstrated that justice could prevail even when corruption reached the highest levels of power. It showed that sometimes the most extraordinary revelations could come from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the courage of one person willing to speak the truth could bring down even the most powerful criminals.